Hi everyone, welcome to the Befores and Afters podcast. I'm Ian Fales from Befores and Afters. I recently got the chance to sit down with visual effects supervisor Kevin Baillie at the View conference in Italy, after Kevin had just presented on the virtual production side of Robert Zemeckis' Pinocchio. What was really interesting about the use of virtual production on the film was that it spanned many areas and several companies, including Mold 3D, MPC, Halon, and Dimension Studios, among others. Also, the virtual production techniques went in different directions that you might think. For example, with LED walls, the production actually used an approach called out-of-view LEDs. And that's the first thing I asked Kevin about for our podcast.
LED walls are abundant in virtual production right now, but I felt like you used a really clever incarnation of them, which you called out-of-view LEDs.
Yep.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, out of view or out of vision, it really just means that we're using LED walls in the way that, you've seen really popularized on The Mandalorian and other things like that. But instead of seeing the result in camera, we're actually positioning the LED walls where the camera can't see them. So they're casting light and reflection into the set. And so they'll give us that really beautifully integrated look of lighting onto the characters that you normally don't get on a traditional blue screen set. But on the flip side, you don't have to track the camera and you don't have to make your assets plussed up to the level where they could actually be final on the wall. In addition to that, the other benefit with using out-of-view LEDs is that the panels themselves can be lighter, which means that it can be bigger and rigged up high. They're cheaper because they're not as high resolution, and because they're not as high resolution, they can also be a lot brighter. So there's actually some technical benefits to using them that you don't get with in-camera LED visual effects. And in addition to that, because you have a traditional blue screen behind your action, then you get a lot of flexibility in post-production, right? Yeah. Which is something that a director like Robert Zemeckis, wants and needs. Like that's, he has the desire to be able to make creative decisions in the context of the edit and not have to make those on day one of the shoot when he is cutting against something he might be shooting on day 20. It's how do you even do that, right? Yeah. Doing things in the context of the edit is really, really important. And so out of view just sort of made sense.
I just thought it was also very much a practical decision based on even your experience on that film Allied and also the state of play of LED walls, which we know are really changing the game of filming, but require setup, time. Mm-hmm. You didn't necessarily have heaps and heaps of time or crew or whatever it was to make it happen in the normal LED way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like a big time commitment to make these assets in a time frame and also there's only so many people in this world that know how to build great looking assets in Unreal, right? And so we probably could have done it at least for a bunch of scenes, but when we asked ourselves why, there weren't enough good answers, right? And I think that really comes down to the sort of first principles approach of thinking, where it's just because there are aspects of something that would be good, or it is a thing that is very popular, it's no more than a pointer to hey, I should investigate this thing. And then it's the responsibility of the team on the production to say, but is it really the right tool? And it's my experience that every solution that is an engineered solution is wrong in some way. The question is how wrong is it, right? And so finding the things that are not a good fit with something so that you can then tailor it to be the best thing that you can do in the amount of time that you have is to me is one of the more fun parts of the process and really, really important for a successful execution on a project.
Well, I jumped into LED walls only because that's what everyone thinks virtual production is.
Yeah.
It's of course so many more things than that. And so let's talk about the different approaches you took. But what I love is that you even said in there that you've pretty much made the film 3 times. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people talk about making the film 3 times, script, shooting and editing, but you're talking about making it 3 times in virtual production.
Yeah, actually
right?
editing, like, because we had a previs version of the movie that was really sort of like using terms from like Roger Rabbit, it would be like the keyframes that the main animators would draw, and then we have the version of it that is we've shot live action. And now we're editing together with post-viz to really like hone in on what the movie, and that's sort of like doing the in-betweens. And then the final is ink and paint, right? And so it is, they are progressions of one another, and ideally you can use, like with our cameras on the movie, 85% of the cameras that we did in the virtual production process ended up on the screen without a single keyframe having been touched. So, there was a lot of work that was sort of like redone, started from scratch, especially in terms of assets and things like that, more than upgraded. But it was all great information, but there was a lot of things that did actually, from like a ones and zeros perspective, flow through to the final product.
Yeah.
Which is pretty fascinating.
Obviously, you chose, Bob Zemeckis chose to use virtual production techniques because you were essentially often having a live action actor, Tom Hanks, interact with what would be CG characters. And the traditional way of filming that is sometimes a bit blind, I suppose you could say.
Yep.
By doing it with some virtual production methods, which we'll talk about, basically it seems like the director got to make his film in a previs format before making the film.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of sounds really dumb and obvious when you say it like that, but that was the point of it, right?
That was the point of it, yeah. And Bob would always look at it and go like, oh, that's just previs, right? Don't get locked into that, because he was so. It was like good enough where he was worried that people would get locked into like thinking that this is the movie that he wants, and he's like, he didn't want to close any doors for other happy accidents or contributions from other people into the process. If you were to watch the sort of the previs version of the movie and the final version of the movie, there are more similarities, I would say, than there are differences, and really, it's like for everybody on the live, like, you can say something to all the live action HODs, and everyone, because we're humans, will interpret that thing differently, right? And the really good teams that work with directors, they learn how to like kind of mind meld with the director, and sort of everybody has a fairly similar interpretation of what the director means. But there's nothing like looking at an image on the screen, right? When you can actually look at and relate the words to the image and make that leap, it's like, it's such a difference. So I think that in this particular case, Bob making the movie as a previs film, it's like he wasn't trying to tell Tom Hanks how to act. And by the way, very rarely did Tom Hanks even look at the previs version of the movie, right? It wasn't about giving direction. It was about helping other people. Like, Bob was kind of famous for, he's like, I don't need any of this. Right, yeah. And he doesn't need any of it because he's got it all in his head. It's really all about, it's a communication tool.
Yes, for crew, for VFX, obviously later down the track, and for actors. Although Tom Hanks has probably done so many of these things, he knows what he's doing. In terms of, say, the classic virtual production methodology, you probably could say it started with an environment build, right?
Yep.
And you had a particular company on board for that. Yeah,
we used Mold 3D came on board to help us with the virtual environments. And actually it was, it's interesting, just talking about virtual production in general, like we kind of started out looking for one vendor that could do it all. And what we found is that there were certain vendors that were really well suited towards different aspects. There's kind of 4 aspects that we were using virtual production. One is the environment build, so we use Mold 3D for that. 2 is the animation, like that was going to feed into the virtual production process. And we knew MPC was going to be doing the final visual effects on the film, so Bob was really insistent. He's like, I want a team from MPC, what he called the brain trust, which is a term he carried over from Roger Rabbit, to be the ones that they could brainstorm ideas. And it's like the modern version of 12 people sitting in the room drinking whiskey and sort of like spitballing ideas. It's just with a lot more distance between us and a lot less whiskey. these days, and so but that sort of creative brainstorming process, he wanted it to be the same people that would follow through on the characters and the character choices that had been made in post-production. So there was Mold3D for the environments, NPC for the characters. All that stuff came together at Halon, who really kind of like unified it and made the experience of doing virtual cameras and shooting the cameras a really amazing experience. And then once we got to set and we had those assets either through a simulcam or on an LED wall, Dimension had the expertise on set to bring all that stuff to life on the walls. So, you might think that like working with 4 individual companies on one process would be a nightmare. And I think if it were different players, it might have been. But all of this team, they were just so in love with the project, and so, and we're all figuring it out together. There were calls that we were on where it was like nobody from the outside would be able to tell that these people were from different companies. Everybody just loved working together.
I would shout out here to my friend Jim at Dimension,
Jim's
who I
amazing,
think really enjoyed that process so much. So
Jim was like, he was a really fantastic part of sort of like, managing the on-set workflow, and he's just got like, and these are the kinds of people that I just love working with again and again, where it's like such a curiosity and excitement for new technologies, but also enough experience to kind of make sure that they're implemented in a way that's production friendly, which is, it's kind of rare, but Jim has that in spades.
When you had something which was a mix of the environments, the characters in a rough animated form, and then some sort of real-time workflow, what was the next step to allow Robert Zemeckis or the DP to scout things or look around or do shot selection or shot mock-ups? What was that process?
Well, we Halon pulled together the animation and the environments together, and then we started off experimenting with like kind of using VR headsets and doing VR scouts, and it was useful in a few scenarios, but more often than not, it's like, when Bob walks onto a set, especially with his DP, the first thing he asks is for a viewfinder, right? A camera viewfinder. It's not like, he doesn't like make a bunch of notes on a set like with just putting his eyeballs on it, because your perception of things changes when you're looking at it through a real lens within a proscenium. So that's kind of the same way he wanted to do virtual scouts, and that's a very personal thing to how Bob likes to work. So we actually just spun up the virtual camera system quite early in the process, sort of mocked up as a camera-shaped set of like tubes and handles and stuff with an HTC Vive puck on the front of it, and that fed into Unreal and Illusion Cartel had provided us with a VCam plugin that we were using, and Halon eventually developed their own partway through the process as well. So various ways of managing the data that was coming in. But Kristen Turnipseed from Halon, she was like the stage person that, Bob, if Bob wanted his camera scale to be twice what it would be in real life, or if he wanted to go to the other side of set, you just say, all right, Kristen, take me over there, and he would like look around the sets, right, with real lenses on this camera, and see the result on sort of the 4 TVs that were on our walls.
Where did you shoot that? At Cardington or in a production office with tracking?
We shot it wherever we were. So Bob's office is in Carpinteria, this little sleepy beach town just south of Santa Barbara, and he has an office there with a kind of a bullpen area. That's so we put up just 2 consumer HTC Vive lighthouses and the Vive on the front of this thing, the puck on the front of this thing, and that's all we needed to set up a VCam system in addition to the software side of things. But when we went to the UK for prep, a couple months before the film, we took that system with us and spun it up over there, and Kristen came with us and was sort of the boots on the ground in the room helping us shoot. And then when we went back to Carpinteria, there were still some of the the shots that needed to be designed in post-production, and we used the same systems. And meanwhile, our camera operator, Pete Wilkie, was over in the UK, working with Kristen in Santa Monica, and Pete's there with a Nodo wheel system doing final camera. So it really was like pretty geographically free, the process.
And even that early stage with the director holding this puck contraption, it led to scenes and shot selects that would then be edited.
Yeah. So the scouts would be the scouts, right? And then we would, and sometimes we'd have the character animation in there, sometimes we wouldn't. If there was character animation in there, Bob would sort of give the animators direction, like he was talking to actors and say, like, oh, I might want to do a shot like this, like, he should, turn left instead of right. But as soon as we were done with that, we had real shoot days, right? Where we would have a script supervisor there, we would have all of our, our team was there, and Bob would go through and he would shoot all the coverage that he would shoot on the live action day. And just like a machine, I mean, we would plow through 200 setups in a day. And we would slate them like real stuff. And then the result would then get rendered out overnight and sent to the cutting room, just like dailies from a live action set. And the cutting room would just cut away. And then we'd go do reshoots if we needed to, or we'd, move on to the next scene the next day.
And that clearly is about making the film to then inform the live action shoot, right?
That's exactly the idea.
Yeah. And so how did that inform set builds and what would be blue screen? And obviously we've talked about LED walls. Is that just more like a normal VFX conversation where you're having that with the production designer and other people?
Yeah, it's more like a normal conversation, except you're doing it with very accurate pictures and lenses and things beforehand. So it's almost like, that saying like hindsight is 2020. Well, like virtual production kind of helps make foresight 2022, right? Where it's just like the number of surprises that came up in live action production were so minimal. I mean, they were things that like you couldn't control, right? Everything that we could control, which was almost everything, because we shot everything indoors on a soundstage, we kind of knew what we were getting ourselves into. Like the first time I walked into the physical build of Geppetto's workshop, I felt like I had already been in it for months, right? It just felt completely familiar because we'd been spending so much time in there, which is a really remarkable thing to like have that emotional level of familiarity with the place, even though you've never actually seen it in real life. It just goes to show how effective the tech is and the process is.
Now tell me how maybe a typical shot with Tom Hanks on set and Pinocchio would be filmed.
I wish there was a typical shot. No, it was like it's funny. We had this like bag of tools, this toolkit of different ways that we could do the interactions between Tom Hanks and Pinocchio. And Tom is like an exceptionally talented actor. So, he could work with all of them. And we had everything from like the real hero Pinocchio puppet, which was always a little scary to work with because there was only like one hero Pinocchio head, right? I mean, we had backups too, but they didn't look the same. And then we had like a foam version of him that you could Tom could pick up and hold, but like if you dropped him, it was no big deal. We had versions where we could take off arms or legs depending on what the motion was going to be. We had stands with like 2 LEDs on them that represented the eyes for eyeline, and we would have multiple stands. So if Pinocchio moved from one side of the workbench to the other, you could turn off one set of LEDs and turn on the other at the timing of the director wanted, so that Tom could shift his eye lines, right? And yeah, there were like times where we literally stuck Pinocchio's arm at the end of like a pole, and that was all we had, right? Depending on what we needed. All the previs, this sort of virtual production process led up to, like, when I would sit down with Gary, our props guy, and we would brainstorm, what do we need in order to sell the interaction in this setup? We were able to, like, it's like we just had, like, a board where it was, like, 3 grabs, beginning, middle, end of a setup, the action, and then, like, I made these little icons of like, okay, like it's going to be a laser pointer at the beginning of the shot to help the camera have something to follow, and then it's going to be the armature rig with only the left arm on it, and here's the assumptions, right? And so we could plan out every live action setup that we were going to do in and so Gary and his team could just have that stuff available and ready to rock. And it would just make sense to, Bob and Tom and everybody. And of course there were times where Tom wanted to interact with Pinocchio in a different way than what was in the previs. But at that point, we'd gone through so many scenarios through the previs that we'd be like, oh, that's going to be like this thing. What do we plan for this? Oh, okay, cool. Let's get that out there. So it was like we'd been practicing, right? For weeks leading up to any moment, so we could just react and know what to do.
It's like a whole new different kind of rehearsal. Mm-hmm. Like a not super loose in the end, like super tight.
Yeah, and the other thing is a lot of times most of the crew doesn't get to go to the rehearsals, right? And they certainly don't get to go through the read-throughs and stuff, right? So and depending on the movie, sometimes the stand-ins will do the rehearsals, or the actors they're not really they're sort of saving the real stuff for being on camera, right? Which is totally fair, because it's they got to pour a lot of emotion into the acting. So I think that this is sort of a way of getting the mechanical parts of it accessible to everyone on the production, right? And there's still going to be the things that happens when a great actor shows up and has an idea or really unleashes the emotion that changes our perception, and then we can adjust. But we're adjusting from a foundation that is more than nothing, which I think is extremely valuable.
How did any kind of live comp, real-time comp, or on-set tracking work for live action shooting where you did have some virtual backgrounds already built? Mm-hmm. How did things like that work on set?
Yeah, well, we had all the assets already from the previous set of things. So Dimension took those and kind of ingested them from the Mold3D Halon workflow and prepped them to make sure that frame rates were going to be great on set. And if there were changes that had happened to the set between our initial sort of virtual art department previous build to what was built for real, they would sort of Dimension would reconcile the differences, and then so they would have a machine that has Unreal and an Ultimac keyer, and the camera tracking systems really varied between the different setups. If we had a big wide open space, we used an ultra wideband based system from Race Logic. If it was in a tight space, we would use an HTC Vive puck. There were a lot of shots that we shot off of a Techno Dolly, which is, it's like a techno crane, but, able to record and feedback, motion. So depending on, the device we're using, the tracking data would be fed into Unreal, and there would be this magical real-time comp of a set that's mostly blue screen, but now we're looking through the viewfinder and actually seeing what the final scene is going to look like, which was I don't know how you compose shots without that tech in a mostly blue screen world.
In the talk you mentioned a new tracking system. Was it the one you just...
Yeah, the Race Logic system. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And you hadn't used anything like that
Nobody
before?
had.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was our production was the first production to use it. And, there were definitely growing pains. There are with every new technology. But the thing that I think is the most important is to have a team that A, is extremely smart, and B, never gives up even in the face of things just when you hit big roadblocks. And the Race Logic team was that. And the Dimension team working with them were also that. So yeah, by the end of the shoot, we had worked through most of the issues that were truly unforeseeable, and really getting great results. And rumor has it that they've obviously been continuing to improve this stuff. I know that I think DNEG's using them on a couple of virtual production shows as well, and it's a really cool tech because it's not as sensitive to occlusions and things as a traditional optical camera tracking system is, and it's also just sort of you can kind of hide the beacons in ways that are easier than hiding the sort of mocap cameras and things. So yeah, I mean, it's really neat, promising stuff. It's basically like a movie version of your AirTags, right?
Yeah.
And I think it shows a huge amount of promise.
This is a live action film with CG characters. There's obviously some fully CG sequences in the film. How did you approach those in terms of any kind of real-time work? I remember you maybe mentioning the DP had a hand in lighting, pre-lighting, or even post-lighting those to some degree.
Yeah, so, well, what's the difference, right?
Yeah, I think that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So we would, we made fairly limited use of real-time characters on set because, to be honest, like laser pointers and sticks with things on them is still like, because like Tom, as he's acting, can't see the CG Pinocchio on the screen, right? We're not going to stick a VR headset on him, right? So those kinds of more old school techniques, based on the work we've done in virtual production, were much more valuable. There were some shots where the composition was going to be affected by the CG character, like Jiminy Cricket standing on a shelf. And we're shooting past him to Geppetto. So we would put that live through the camera so that Bob could see that based on the previous animation. And so I think that there was certainly use for that, but we really only used it where it was really needed, because otherwise it was just going to be distracting. At the end of every day, or not every day, but like maybe once or twice a week, we would have a Zoom call that's a session with the DP once he got back to his hotel room, where we would get together with Edward at Mold 3D, and Don would direct the lighting of, and it might be a thing that we're going to need for simulcam in a week. It might be a thing that's never going to be shot live action because it's an all CG scene, but we wanted to set the looks for it. And the tools are such now where like Don can say like slow that down by half a stop, and there's an actual sort of equivalence in Unreal that will allow the DP to speak DP speak and see the result that he's expecting. So I think that was and those looks, they flowed through as a blueprint for the final lighting in a lot of cases, which was very cool. And the other thing worth mentioning is like we did some of that in during the shoot as well, or during prep, where I remember the scene where Pinocchio and Geppetto come outside the front door for the first time, and Pinocchio makes reference to the sun. It's like, what's that shiny bright thing up there? And it's a whole cute joke that is kind of a direct tie-in to the original Pinocchio. Well, we had the sun coming in from the right, and I don't remember why. Maybe it's just kind of what fell off the truck that way. But we had the sun coming in from the right. And I could see Don the whole time Bob was shooting this scene going like, he's sitting there just thinking. He's just thinking. And then the next day he comes in and he's like, hey, Bob, that scene that you shot yesterday, like in virtual production, like, what do you think if the sun's coming in from the other way? And then he went into like a bunch of the reasons why. And it was just so cool to see virtual production and virtual production have that effect like on a live action decision so early in the process that might not have otherwise happened. I mean, it's a big deal. Those lights that they use to recreate the sun they're big and heavy and hard to move, right? And if we hadn't made that decision early, it would have been very hard to sort of accommodate a change like right then and there on the day. And so, but Don sort of ended up being able to play with the lighting in Unreal to sort of, we called it workshopping, but like workshop what the lighting might be like for a live action setup that was coming down the pipe.
Super cool. And not possible or not done 5 years ago.
Yeah,
really,
well, even a couple of years ago. I remember like when we did a bunch of like previs in Unreal and virtual camera stuff in Unreal for The Witches, and very different movie, and different timescales and all that kind of stuff. But like, that was before real-time ray tracing was a thing, right? It just wasn't possible. And the hardware wasn't there, the software wasn't there. And it was, it's like, it was hard to really connect with those visuals. Like, you kind of got it, but it's like, they didn't look real, right? So it was kind of, it just sort of was like, all right, well, these are kind of, Mickey Mouse, in the sense that like shadows wouldn't be connected to the mice, the reflections wouldn't be real, this, that, and the other. They looked great for the time, but they just weren't real.
Yeah.
Whereas on Pinocchio, because we were using physically based lighting and ray tracing everywhere, which the team was a little bit nervous about committing to in the beginning, but by the end they were like, yeah, we're so glad we did that, because it's like, it actually made things easier workflow-wise. You don't have to like worry about all your shadow maps and light bakes and all this stuff as much. But it also, like, when a character like has a sharp contact shadow that then diffuses off into a soft shadow, or a reflection that is perfectly connected to their feet, it just is. It's like or bounce light from like their hand onto their face, right? It just makes things feel real, and it flips a switch in the brain, especially for like those of us who are not technical.
Well, you made this point in the talk as well, which I loved, and I think is a big deal for things like non-VFX people looking at previs or post-vis or shots that are work in progress. Because when they're grayscale or animatics, they can't always connect that this will be the final shot. Mm-hmm. I think that's the point you were making.
Yeah,
right?
it's
but
like...
now with physically based rendering in real time, ray tracing, you can reach a certain point that makes it feel more real.
Yeah, it makes it relatable. Helping people to make the leap between what they're seeing on the screen and reality, right? And the sort of the closer those become, the stronger the bridge you're building is becoming. So yeah, because it's like, it's like if you show your parents a gray shaded render, like most of them are like, what am I looking at? Like, it's just like, because it's like, it's not only that it's gray, it's like it doesn't have lighting, or it's some like wacky screen space ambient occlusion that just sort of like, just doesn't look and feel real. And we've been doing this long enough where we can translate that image in our minds and kind of get a sense of what it might look like as a final. And that takes decade plus to be able to like get to that point where you really can like make an educated guess. So to expect that same level of a leap from anybody else is like totally unfair. But that's where virtual production comes in, and especially when it looks good. And that's why it's important that it looks good, right? It's not because it'll ever end up on a screen anywhere, because it's like going to get, it's going to become a final VFX shot eventually. But so it's not looking good for looking good's sake. It's looking good so that it becomes a relatable image that is more, easy to engage with.
Just on that, it's going to become a final VFX shot eventually. I mean, obviously MPC did the vast majority of work, or all the work on this.
Yep.
A typical film, they'd get maybe the plates and the previs and some turnover notes. Here, I guess they're getting much more than that. They're getting this template. They're getting virtual cameras. As you mentioned, something about the 85% of the cameras tuned in at the beginning were retained. Is that a different process than you're used to, like a VFX studio getting so much?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the dream, right? it's like, oh my God, it's like you're getting a cut of the movie, and really, like we would have turnovers of certain scenes where like Bob would just be like, so just make it like that but better, right? And that was all he needed to say, because it was self-explanatory. So not every scene was like that, and also Bob is like, he's very big in being open to new ideas, so he didn't want to like hamstring anybody with what was in the turnovers. But it was, I mean, for budgeting, for scheduling, for every purpose of asset builds, and knowing like I don't have to build what's under that chair because we never see it, right? It's just like all that stuff is like it's there, right? So I think it's a wealth of information, and should be the thing that makes post-production less insane, right? It's like nobody would build a house without a blueprint, yet a lot of sort of all digital VFX sequences in the past have been like like a bunch of, you know, like old World War II footage, like ripped and cut together, or some, like, you know, it's like whatever, or storyboards, right? It's just like, that's not...
And it's a guess.
And it's a guess
sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. And in the hands of a right filmmaker, they still leave enough room for creative ideas that are good to float to the top, but at least provides a framework for those ideas to fit into.
Kevin, just finally, a couple of years ago, you did some amazing presentations I watched at SIGGRAPH about Welcome to Marwen, and it was about, as much as anything, the evolution of how you were going to bring these dolls, figurines, to life. And there was like, oh, should they be mocap? Mm-hmm. And then you made a really fun joke about your director did Polar Express and had copped that criticism for a long time. Mm-hmm. I really love Polar Express, just so everyone knows.
Yeah.
You know, and kids love it, and it's just become a different film than the criticism it might have got at the time. Anyway, I wondered on Pinocchio whether you had explored any motion capture for that character and all others. And again, because it's a Zemeckis thing, he might say, "No way are we doing motion capture."
Yeah, you know, in the very beginning, we had extensive conversations about this, and I had this like really stupid idea of mocapping the Pinocchio puppet and having a master puppeteer be the one that is sort of driving the animation. We did get a master puppeteer in, but not to mocap what he was doing. We videotaped, and we actually connected him with the animation team. So they had like a shared Zoom session where they workshopped out, like, well, what if Pinocchio does this? What if Pinocchio does this? And this puppeteer, Ronnie Ledru, he's like just incredible. He worked with Frank Oz on like Labyrinth and stuff way back in the day, and the sweetest guy, so talented. And so we learned a lot from that. And at the end of the day, though, Bob he reminded me that we weren't doing a literal marionette, right? Like, Pinocchio's come to life, right? So he desperately wants to be a real boy. So he really wants to feel like part puppet, part real boy.
I get it.
And so we couldn't mocap a real boy either, because he's not real boy.
Because it'd be too smooth or too human, like.
Too human, right? Yeah. So it had to be somewhere in between this video reference that we'd gotten from the puppet and a real boy. And so what the animation team did is they just started to shoot videos of themselves doing all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And, you know, sometimes they would, you know, splice together like 10 different actions from 10 different, you know, iPhone videos that they'd recorded. And, you know, we'd all look at that, or Christophe, our animation supervisor, or his right hand, Kave, up there at NPC Montreal, they would look at this and they would, you know, kind of tweak it all so the, you know, multiple people could be giving input on what Pinocchio's performance should be throughout a scene, but it all kind of felt consistent and of Pinocchio's character at the end of the day. So the animators were actually, you know, the ones, and inspired by the voice performance of Ben Ainsworth, that, you know, really helped to, they were sort of the unsung heroes in bringing Pinocchio's motion to life. And keyframe animation was the right tool for that task, right? And it was also the thing that was sort of the closest to paying homage to the original Pinocchio. Honest John the fox and Gideon the cat, they could have been mocap, but we also didn't want too big of a disconnect between Pinocchio and those characters as well. And Bob really just wanted to have more fun with it, right? It's like mocapping them. It's like it would have made them maybe a little bit more realistic, although arguably their animation is pretty realistic. But, you know, is that what Pinocchio needed, right? That film from a style perspective. And, you know, he felt like the answer was no, right? And I look at, you know, a brilliantly executed film like The Lion King, and like a lot of the criticism that it got was that, you know, it was too restricted by what a real animal could do, right? And I think that, like, Pinocchio wanted to feel more like a cartoon in terms of that than a real fox saying a real thing. Yes. So that's where we went.
Yeah. Well, it was just one of the many technical and artistic hurdles you had to think about and overcome. and it's been really interesting hearing about all of them. So thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, no
Really appreciate
worries.
it.
Thanks. It's fun talking about it.